Welcome. Thank you very much for coming out. Thank you. Welcome to the Cathedral Church of St. Luke. My name is Justin Holcomb. I'm the Bishop of the Episcopal Diocese of Central Florida, and this is our cathedral. We have lots of people from around Metro Orlando in the room, and we are thrilled that you are here. Some of you are churched, some of you are dechurched, some of you are unchurched. For some of us, it's complicated. Regardless of your church attendance, we are thrilled that you're here for the Dechurching event named after this book, which you'll hear more about in just a little bit. But this conversation is vital for two reasons. First, 40 million people in the past 30 years have left the church, and half of them are willing to come back. And we need to find out why they left and why are they willing to come back. And so they're not just numbers, though. That's the thing, that you're here because you want to hear about this, but these are people, it could be you, these are friends, family, neighbors, and coworkers. You're going to hear a lot of numbers tonight, and those numbers are important, but the numbers are also faces and people who are made in the image of God. In hearing their voice is really important to honor them and listen to him. So we're here to listen to the amplified voice of the Dechurched, and Jim and Michael are helping amplify their voice. The second is because the goal is not just to get people back into a building so they can give money or vote a certain way. The reason this is so important to welcome people back who have left is because God wants as many people as possible to hear his great news, which is that in Christ, he was reconciling the world to himself. Jesus Christ said that God so loved the world that he sent his only son so that anyone who believes in him would not perish but have everlasting life. And the son was not sent into the world to condemn the world, but that through the Son, the world might be saved. That's why it's so vital. And I've known our speakers for years. We're actually friends. Our families are friends. Our children go to the same school. We've been serving in Orlando for years as ministers. We started a podcast together, and they've been guest lecturers in my apologetics class on numerous occasions. So I'm inviting friends to come up, but my friends are now experts from whom I will learn, which is an absolute blast. So let me give you the technical information about them. So Jim Davis is the pastor, the teaching pastor at Orlando Grace Church. He did his MDiv at Reformed Theological Seminary. He's a host of As in Heaven podcast, and he's the co-author of The Great Dechurching. He's also married to Angela, who is a counselor here in Orlando, and they have 4 children. Michael Graham is the program director for the Keller Center of Cultural Apologetics. He also received his MDiv from Reformed Theological Seminary. He's the executive producer of the podcast As in Heaven, and he is the other co-author. And just so you know, the title, you can't read the whole thing, is The Great Dechurching, Who's Leaving, Why Are They Going, and What Will It Take to Bring Them Back? He's married to Sarah, and they have 2 children, and they live here in Orlando. Please join me in welcoming Jim Davis and Michael Graham.
Thanks, man. Well, thank you, Justin, for that really warm and gracious introduction, and thank you, Cathedral Church of St. Luke, for hosting this event in this amazing building, this beautiful place. And thank you for just being a faithful witness in downtown Orlando for a very long time. I think that especially pertinent to this group, it's helpful to understand that this research was birthed out of the story of Central Florida. So I grew up in Central Florida in Orlando, 3rd generation. Mike grew up in Orlando. And if you were here in Orlando in the 90s and early 2000s, it had a feeling like it was becoming a Christian Mecca of sorts. So it didn't matter what your denominational space was. You could be, if you're in the mainline space, the 2nd largest mainline church in the United States was here in downtown. If you're in the evangelical Baptist realm, First Baptist Church was booming, and their pastor was president of the Southern Baptist Convention. If you're in the non-denominational space, Joel Hunter is pastoring Northland Church, 20,000 people on the cutting edge of church technology in many ways. And then his son planted a church in downtown Orlando that was arguably the coolest millennial church in town, baptizing Magic players like Dwight Howard. And if you were in the charismatic space, we may forget Benny Hinn was here, Paula White was here. And institutionally, these major Christian organizations began to relocate to Orlando, Florida. So in the 90s, Reformed Theological Seminary came here. Campus Crusade for Christ, the largest parachurch missions organization in the world, relocated to Orlando. And then a litany of other ministries like Ligonier, Pioneers, Wycliffe, and others began to relocate their headquarters here as well. Well, fast forward to a Barna report in 2017, and we learn that the Orlando metropolitan area, that's a 7-county area, has the same percentage of evangelicals as New York City and Seattle. And so Mike and I were really affected by that report and began to think through Orlando and began to think through why is it that we feel so much different than New York City and Seattle. And it wasn't hard to see that the majority of people who we interacted with who did not go to church used to. So in New York City and Seattle, it's very different. People have grown up their whole life, maybe never even been inside a church. But a lot of the people in Orlando had grown up in a church, been invested in a church, and for whatever reason, no longer went. So we wanted to understand more about this. We wanted more data. We wanted to understand the scope of it, which we soon found it was not just an Orlando phenomenon. What was going on in Orlando is paradigmatic for the entire United States. The problem is that there was no real research that we could bank what we were doing on. Anecdotally, you heard that Bishop Holcomb over here, he teaches apologetics at Reformed Theological Seminary. My wife took his class when she was getting her counseling degree there, and she wanted to do her research paper on dechurching. And Justin said, that's great, but there's no research. You can't do a research paper if there's no research. So this got our wheels turning, and we decided to commission the most comprehensive nationwide, academically peer-reviewed, quantitative study, that's a mouthful, ever done on dechurching in the United States. We commissioned social scientists, Dr. Ryan Burge and Dr. Paul Jupe, to do this study. We raised about $100,000 to do this study, and we learned a lot from this study. There were over 7,000 participants in the study, over 600 data points. There were 3 different phases to the study, and the first study, the goal was to prove or disprove this thesis. We are currently in the largest and fastest religious shift in the history of our country. And we proved it. So we proved it, as Justin said, by learning that over 40 million adult Americans over the past largely 25 years have stopped going to church. Now, it's important to know the way we define a dechurched person is that somebody who used to go to church at least monthly and now goes less than 1 time per year. So to put this in perspective, if we're going to go at it by percentage, previously the largest religious shift in the history of our country were the 25 years post-Civil War. There was at least a 12% uptick in that 25-year period in the percentage of churchgoers in the United States. Our current religious shift over the past 25 years is 1.25 times greater than that one, just going the opposite direction. In terms of numbers, it is larger than the first Great Awakening, the second Great Awakening, and every Billy Graham crusade combined. So that's the part that initially we want to land. The United States is in the middle of the largest and fastest religious shift in the history of our country. Then we wanted to know, who is dechurching? Who are these people? And if you just pay attention to what you see in the news and on social media, you would think, well, the dechurched person had a really bad experience in church. This person has deconverted completely, probably is wrestling through gender identity and sexuality, sexual ethics that may be different than the church. And while those types of dechurched people certainly exist, do you want to know the number one reason for dechurching in America? I moved. We actually found that of the 40 million adult Americans who have left church, 30 million of them did so without any pain point. So at the highest level, we then began to understand, okay, some people left with a pain point, about 10 million Americans, but 30 million didn't. So we began to distinguish between these two groups, and we called one the dechurched casualties. They have the pain point. And the other 30 million Americans we called the casually dechurched. They moved. They had life transitions, they got divorced, they had children. Their children maybe grew up and they were consumed in travel sports. The children had their activities. Church became inconvenient for whatever reason. And of course, then there was COVID. People stopped going to church depending on what state you lived in, anywhere from 3 to 18 months. People developed new rhythms, new habits. Many people moved during that time, which combined are just more and more reasons for this casually dechurched group to increasingly grow. Now, in the church casualty realm, some are Christians, some are not. We're going to show you more about that. In the casually dechurched realm, some are Christians, some are not, as best we can tell. But what we really began to see is that the dechurched person is not a monolithic profile. And so we wanted to, in our third phase of our study, dial in even more deeply. And so we used something called machine learning. It's good to know this isn't just two pastors putting their finger up in the air or polling, our 200 best friends or doing a Facebook poll. We had a machine learning algorithm mine these massive amounts of data that we had to compare common answers and help us to understand who is dechurching in more granular detail. And I'll let Mike take it from there.
So, machine learning, that's just a fancy word to say this is how we efficiently and without bias introduce people who had very common clusters of answer choices of why they dechurched, what kind of demographics they are, how much willingness that they have to return to the church, and what reasons why they might return to the church. And so we're going to talk about 5 different profiles here. We're going to go through these things relatively quickly. We're going to first cover 4 different types of dechurched evangelicals, and then we're going to cover the mainline and Roman Catholic dechurched together. Now, what's interesting to note about the mainline and Roman Catholic Church and why we're going to cover those two together is by and large, the mainline and Roman Catholic people who dechurched look very similar in just about every category. Now, the main difference between the mainline and Roman Catholic dechurched would be the Catholic dechurched were a little bit more sensitive to clergy scandal in the broader world. And, if you're familiar at all with the history and, films like Spotlight and these kinds of things, you can understand why. And then the mainline dechurched were a little bit more sensitive to moving, as Jim mentioned, the very top choice for why people dechurched. And so, without further ado, I'm going to start, though, with the 4 different types of dechurched evangelicals. Now, imagine with me here for a moment the first profile. Cultural Christians. Now, there's 15 million of the 40 million people who dechurched who came out of evangelical churches. The Roman Catholics and mainline together are about 20 million. But cultural Christians, this is about 8 million of the 15 million people who left. Imagine with me the cultural Christian. You're about 40 years old, you're male, you were probably never a Christian, and life seemed to be working well for you, didn't necessarily have a big problem with the church, and just kind of moved on from church about a decade ago. And so the cultural Christians, this is a group of people, they didn't necessarily have a big issue with the church. By and large, they're in that cultural, that casual dechurched category. Not necessarily a lot there that looks catastrophic. The average age of the person who is a cultural Christian who dechurched is 40 years old, and they dechurched about a decade ago. This group, interestingly enough, is almost entirely monolithically white. And one thing to note, as we're going through all of the data here, the machine learning algorithm that Jim referred to, we did not allow the algorithm to sort based on race or ethnicity. And so these clusters were developed without the algorithm having the benefit of seeing that. And we'll circle back and forth. We'll play a little bit back and forth with that, and I think Bishop Holcomb will ask some questions about that. But it's important to note, this group is monolithically white, 98%, married. These are people who were doing well for themselves. They had above average income, above average education, lots of full-time work in this group. Now, here's where things start to get interesting in terms of the belief system for this group of people. Now, we developed something that we called an orthodoxy score with respect to all of these different profiles. Here's what we mean by that. Largely what we were looking for were things like what you would find in the Nicene Creed. The divinity of Jesus, the humanity of Jesus, the sinlessness of Jesus, Jesus's substitutionary death and his atonement, the resurrection of Jesus, the reliability of the Bible, and the Trinity. So this group of people, this profile, the cultural Christians, had the lowest orthodoxy score. On average, they would answer, accurately relative to the Nicene Creed, about 56% of those, kind of 7 questions. Now, here's the real kicker. This is why you know that this group largely probably are not followers of Christ. Only 1% of this group said that Jesus is the Son of God. 1%. So this is probably not a group of people who were probably serious Christians and probably not in the faith. And again, this is a little bit over half of the people who left evangelical churches. Interestingly enough, this group leans center-left politically. However, they're not necessarily super progressive on things like racial justice. America does seem to be working well for this group of people as well. Okay, why did the cultural Christians leave? The number one reason, and you'll see a lot of these casual reasons that Jim kind of alluded to, was attending was inconvenient. The second from the top reasons was my friends were not attending worship service. Number 3, they moved. There's some other things in the mix, things like suffering, wanting to express their gender identity, scandal in the broader church, in the broader culture, and feeling that church was too restrictive of their sexual freedom, or things like worshiping online. But by and large, these seem to be issues that seem to be a bit more casual in nature, and it doesn't seem that these people were really Christians in the historic sense of our creeds and confessions. Now, what's interesting is that almost half, 48% of this group, said they'd be willing to return to church today, right now. And so here are the top reasons why they said that they would be willing to return. Number 1, new friends. Number 2, lonely and want to make new friends. 3, this one's like the one that's not like the others. Supernatural phenomena. This is the only time any group chose supernatural phenomenon. It's interesting.
The Bible would have to levitate.
Yeah. Begin to miss church. A friend invites me. Spouse wants to go. Move and want to make new friends. And a good community. And here's what you see among the cultural Christians. There's tremendous opportunities there, particularly relationally. Almost all of those things have to do with interpersonal human relationships. So there's a lot of opportunities with people who have, who fit this category and this profile. So what does this group of people need in order to return to church? The top thing that I would say is they need sincere community. They also need, interestingly enough, we didn't cover this, they need mental health help. Kind of surprisingly, relative to their education and their high education and their high income, their mental health was not in a good place, particularly as it pertained to anxiety, depression, and loneliness. And there's a lot more that we cover in the book, but there actually are significant health benefits of people who go to church on a weekly or greater basis. You can look at, Harvard professor Tyler Vanderwees on this. We talk about it in the book. The third thing that this group needs is they need sound doctrine and a church that will care about spiritual formation. Spiritual formation is where, we are formed in our head, our heart, and our hands, and we grow more into the likeness of Christ in the fullest sense of those things. This group also needs us to do better in terms of how we engage with them while they're in the 18 to 39-year-old age range, because by and large, they're, on average, they're dechurching around the age of 40. So this is the cultural Christians. Now, there's 3 more dechurched evangelical profiles that we're going to cover. Each one of these next 3 groups is about the same size. So we're talking about 2.5 million or so, more or less, each for the next 3 types of dechurched evangelicals. Now, the next type of dechurched evangelical we're going to talk about is the mainstream evangelical. I want you to imagine for a moment, not a 40-year-old man like the first group, a 40-year-old woman. She's a mom, she's married, and she dechurched in the last 2 or 3 years. But she's definitely a Christian, and she loves Jesus, and she misses church, but she just got out of the habit. And she got out of the habit because of maybe she moved, or maybe COVID, or maybe there was something with travel sports with the kids, or just life got busy. But tremendous spiritual sensitivity. So this group is overwhelmingly female. They dechurched very recently, within the last 3 years. There's an average income, average education. This group is similarly almost entirely white. However, where things get very different from the first group is this group is very, very orthodox. They very much understand the core tenets of the Nicene Creed. In fact, the orthodoxy score of this group is actually better than evangelicals who still go to church. So their score was 86%. I think the people who still go to church is about 85% among evangelicals. Now, interestingly enough, 98% of this group said that Jesus is the Son of God. See, that's why we use the machine learning algorithm, because you end up with these clusters that actually make sense. This group also had a really high view, the highest view of the Bible as well among any of these groups. Now, interestingly enough, this group leans center-right politically. However, this group was more sensitive to some of the issues of our day that maybe you wouldn't have thought relative to the first group that leans center-left. This group was more sensitive to matters of race in the United States. So interesting stuff. When you do data, it doesn't always fit super clean narratives and these kinds of things. So that's why you actually poll and look at these things. All right. So why did the mainstream evangelicals leave? Number 1 reason, what do you think it is?
I bet it's I moved.
I moved. Okay. Number 2, attendance was inconvenient. Number 3, COVID-19 got me out of the habit. 4, divorce, remarriage, or some other family change or shift. And then the 5th and 6th, all of those are all very casual reasons. There's a little bit of there in, there's a little bit of relational tension. I don't think it's the highest stuff that's there, but there were some people that felt that they didn't fit within the congregation, and some people who didn't experience much love within the congregation. By and large, though, it looks like this group largely fits under the category of people who are casually dechurched. Now, I want to introduce to you guys 3 different levels of relational engagement that people might need from us. The first level of relational engagement that people might need from us is somebody who's in our life who just needs a nudge. That's all they need to come back to church. Now, a nudge might look like, texting somebody and inviting them, hey, will you come to church with me and, grab lunch after, this Sunday? I'm doing something interesting, or there's some compelling reason, right? Or, you're at the water cooler with, a coworker, or you're talking out in the driveway, with a lemonade with a neighbor. Those are the kinds of things that kind of fit that category of a nudge. Now, these are probably people who are, loved ones, friends, neighbors, people you have, long-standing, existing relationship with. The second category of, level of relationship that you might need to have with somebody is the level of the dinner table, okay? So the dinner table level of relationship is what some people who have more distance from the church are going to need from us. Then there's a third category of people who we're going to need to be in their lives for years, if not decades, and they probably still won't come back to church for a wide variety of reasons. And so those are the three levels of relationship that I want to refer to as we're talking about some of these profiles moving forward. Now, when we're talking about mainstream evangelicals coming back to church, these are nudge people. They want to come back to church. They miss church. And you're going to see that here when I talk about the reasons why they're going to be willing to come back. The first category that we talked about are cultural Christians. Some of those are dinner table folks, and some of them are nudge folks. And you'll know best because you can exercise discernment, and you know the people who are in your lives, and you know what different people need. So with respect to mainstream evangelicals, why are they willing to return? Number one reason, new friends. Number two reason, God tells them to go back in a significant way. 3, they find a church that they like. 4, they begin to miss church. 5, they feel the distance from God. 6, a good pastor. 7, lonely and want to make new friends. 8, they find a church that take both doctrine and ethics seriously. Now, I want to point out 3 things that these people that are important to these folks. They're looking for community. They are looking for a healthy church that's going to emphasize a gospel that's true, good, and beautiful. And they're looking for good friendships as well. So there's a lot of opportunities there relationally, and there's a lot of opportunities there institutionally. So really, they're just looking for, good friendships and a healthy local church. What do they need from us? The top thing that this group needs from us is they need that nudge. They need somebody to just come alongside side with them and just give them that nudge to come back into church. They also need a church context that is going to take doctrine and ethics seriously. I think it's good if we challenge some of the distance that somebody might be experiencing from God, or maybe missing church, or maybe feeling a little bit, that distance from the Lord isn't good, because I think that's there. And then, like the first group, we need to engage well this group in the 18 to 39-year-old age range. Third group, very different than the first two. Again, roughly 2.5 million people. But I want you to imagine with me a new person. It's a woman. She's 53. She has been very hurt by the church. She had very bad experiences interpersonally in the church, and she probably had bad experiences with the church as an institution. But this person probably actually still has a lot of affection for Jesus. Now, this is the ex-evangelical group. Now, what's interesting about the first group, the cultural Christians, 48% of them were willing to return to an evangelical church. The second group, and I didn't mention this, the mainstream evangelicals, 100% of them were willing to return to an evangelical church today. Do you know what percentage of the people who are ex-evangelical who are willing to return to an evangelical church today are? 0. 0% of these people are willing to return to an evangelical church. Now, the good news is, there's a lot of different kinds of churches out there. There's a lot of different traditions. And we're going to see in a minute that there's actually a lot of spiritual sensitivity, and not all hope is lost with this particular group. But let me not get ahead of myself. This group is struggling in life, not just church. There's below average income. There's below average education. American institutions are working very poorly for this group of people. They're really struggling, not just with faith, but they're struggling in every area of life. There's a low perspective on every institution, whether those things are economic, political, sociological, educational system. All of those things are very much struggling. Now, what's interesting, though, relative to their beliefs, they had the second highest orthodoxy score of any of the profiles that we're going to look at, 70%. Even further, 97% of this group said, Jesus is the Son of God. 97%. They also had a relatively high view of the Bible. Politically speaking, this group was 58% independent. Let that settle in for a second. 58% independent. This group is very allergic to political partisanship. They're very allergic to racism. They're very allergic to misogyny. And they're very allergic to abuse. So, it's important, and I appreciate the amen, that we give voice to people who, by and large, do seem to still love Jesus, but they've really struggled with their relationship with the church. And whether that was interpersonally, institutionally, or both, it was important for us in this study to give voice to those things. So, why did the ex-evangelicals leave? And you're going to see different reasons here, okay? Those first two profiles that we looked at, they looked more like the casually dechurched. This group looks almost entirely like dechurched casualties. So, number one reason why they left, they didn't fit within the congregation. Number two, they moved. Number three, attendance was inconvenient. But number four, I didn't experience much love within the congregation. 5, I disagreed with the politics of the congregation. 6, negative experiences you personally had in an evangelical church. 7, I no longer believed what the congregation believed. And then 8, I disagreed with the politics of the clergy. So you're seeing a lot of tension here, a lot of friction, okay? Some of that is interpersonal, some of that is institutional. Now, even though 0% of this group was willing to return to an evangelical church, many of these people are willing to return to a Christian church of some sort. And I think that that's good news. Here we are in a church that loves Jesus deeply, that's not in the evangelical tradition, that's in the mainline tradition, where I think that, the profile that we're looking here could easily find themselves a very happy home. So, why did this group told us what kind of reasons they would be willing to return to a non-evangelical church. Here's the top reasons. Number 1, God tells them to go back in a significant way. 2, they find a church that they like. 3, a good pastor. 4, 21% of them say that they're never going back, okay? 5, they feel distance from God. 6, they find a church that cares about justice and compassion for vulnerable people. 7, a good community. 8, they begin to miss church. So when you look at all of this cluster of reasons why the ex-evangelical group would be willing to return to church, you see tremendous spiritual sensitivity that's there. There's sensitivity to God, and there is a desire for a healthy community. They're looking for a healthy community. They're looking for a healthy pastor. They're looking for a church that cares about justice and compassion for vulnerable people. Well, good. These churches exist, and so it's important. I think the ex-evangelical group is easier to identify, I think, sometimes than other people, because it's easier to see when there's pain rather than apathy. And so, what do the ex-evangelicals need? They need a nonpartisan church community, okay? Remember, 58% of this group don't identify with either, the GOP or the Democratic Party. They need a church that's going to take doctrine and ethics seriously, a church that's going to care for vulnerable people. 3, they need mental health help. I'm kind of a geek, okay? I like spreadsheets. I would much rather be sitting in front of a spreadsheet right now than talking to you. No offense. When I was looking at the spreadsheet here, all these data points and all these people, I got to this one row in this one column, and it was about the level of suicidal thoughts. And there was a scale that you were to rate yourself on 0 to 100. And 0 was you were doing very poorly with respect to suicidal thoughts in your life. And 100 was you had this was not an issue at all. You had no thoughts of suicidal thoughts or ideation. This group had the lowest score of anyone on this category. Do you want to know how they rank themselves on average? 16. 16. So, the ex-evangelicals need mental health help. They also need clergy that's going to be empathetic, and as well as an empathetic church community. Our fourth profile is the BIPOC dechurched. BIPOC stands for Black, Indigenous, Persons of Color. Here's what I want you to imagine for this profile. A 51-year-old African-American man who is very successful in either business, law, medicine, and they dechurched probably during med school or law school. Interestingly enough, this group had the highest income and the highest education of any group. And this group was 76% African American, 13% Hispanic Latino, and 68% male. That means over half of this 2.5 million size group of people were African American men. And this group is very upwardly mobile. They work very, very hard, and they're doing very well for themselves in American culture and society, in spite of institutions that largely didn't work well for them. So this group looked a lot similar to the cultural Christian group with respect to their orthodoxy score. Like the cultural Christians, they don't particularly look, by and large, like the Christians here today. They were independent to center-left politically, not super progressive on things like race, interestingly enough. Here's why they left. Number one reason. Do you have a guess what it is? They moved. Number two, faith wasn't working for them. 3, they had other priorities for their time and money. There was some suffering. There were some that began to doubt God's existence. There was scandal in their congregation among the clergy. They didn't see the congregation doing enough good in the community, and the messages were not relevant to their life. The BIPOC group looks a little bit like some of the casual reasons and some of the casualty reasons. There's clearly more friction that's here. Now, bear in mind, this group is 0% white, 100% non-white. And again, the algorithm did not have the benefit of seeing ethnicity. Why would this group be willing to return? And like the cultural Christians, over half of this group are willing to return here today, I believe 52%. Number one reason, new friends. 2, move and make new friends. 3, lonely and want to make new friends. 4, child wants to go. 5, friend invites me. A good community, spouse wants to go. Feel the distance from God. 6 of these 8 reasons are relational, okay? They're just relational. So what does this group need from us? Well, they need relationship and deep friendship that with people who are embodying cultural and emotional intelligence. They also need congregations that are going to care about sound doctrine and spiritual formation. And this group tended to dechurch earlier than any of the other groups. They dechurched in the 13 to 30-year-old age range, largely in the late 1990s. Now, here's our 5th profile. This is going to be the mainline and Roman Catholic folks together. And remember the difference, with the Catholic dechurch being a little bit more sensitive to clergy scandal in the broader church, and then the mainline dechurched being more sensitive to moving. Now, the mainline folks dechurched the first, and we're talking late 80s, all the way through the mid-90s is when people were leaving the mainline church. The Roman Catholic Church were largely early 90s to late 90s. The evangelicals were dechurching later, largely from the mid-90s to now. So here's what I want you to picture. Imagine, this is the mainline Roman Catholics. Imagine a female who's on average in her mid-50s, and she's white, and there's just, in terms of, it's a mixture of casual and casualty reasons. Things like moving to a new community, not fitting within the congregation, political friction, other priorities for time and money, attendance was inconvenient, and not experiencing much love within the congregation. Now, from an orthodoxy score standpoint, this group looks a lot like the cultural Christians and the BIPOC group. And their average orthodoxy score was 57%. Now, here's what's different. 69% of this group said that Jesus is the Son of God. So doing a little bit better on Jesus.
Even the Bible.
Yeah, but they had a relatively low view of the Bible, okay? And so there's some real opportunities there with respect to the Bible. This group was the most progressive politically, center-left to left-leaning. And like the ex-evangelicals, this group was very allergic to racism, misogyny, political partisanship, and abuse. So they left because they moved, they had other priorities, relational friction in the congregation, political friction in the congregation, some doubts to God's existence, inconvenience, and some other casual reasons. Now, what does this group of people need from us? They need word and deed together. They need congregations that are going to avoid misogyny, racism, partisan politics, and they're going to be sensitive to things like abuse and have systems and structures to try to be preventative of those things. They also need churches that are going to take the historic creeds and confessions seriously. They need Nicene Creed Christianity. They need sound doctrine. They need spiritual formation. And they're just overall across the board, there needs to be a higher regard for the Bible. Interestingly enough, what we saw is the higher a church took the Bible, the less likely in those contexts people were dechurching. So.
Yeah, I mean, historically, they're going back to the beginning of the Enlightenment movement. You can see efforts in churches to shed certain miracles to be able to relate to the culture more. Our study shows the more churches hold on to the historic Nicene Creed Christianity, including miracles, the better they're going to do from a data point of view. All right, so let me give you some of the high-level insights that we learned. Now that we have those categories, dechurched people are not monolithic. I've said already that we are currently in the largest and fastest religious shift in the history of the United States. That's a big deal. And I would argue Christians and non-Christians alike should care about that. As a pastor, I care about it because, as Justin said in the beginning, these are people, these are souls. Even the Christians who are no longer attending church, the reality is that the children of the dechurched will most likely be unchurched. And as a pastor, I care about that. But even my agnostic and atheist friends should care about the impact this is going to have on the culture in which we live. The GDP of all the people who have left church, the 40 million, is about $1.4 trillion. So if you take the national giving average of 2.5% and you apply it to that 40 million group of 40 million people, about $24 billion a year is leaving the church. And so when you think also about the fact that 40% of the social safety net in our country comes from churches and religious nonprofits, this is going to make a big difference, because even though some of the dechurched people are still giving to those institutions, the likelihood that their children and grandchildren will is pretty low. So, Christian or not, this is going to affect a lot of the world that we live in. And we would also argue is going to contribute to the fracturing and polarizing of the political conversations that we're having. Second, we've said this, over half of the people who have dechurched are actively willing to return. That was a big shocker to us. We didn't realize how many people would still be willing to return. Number 3, this is very interesting. Education and dechurching are inversely related. You often hear things like, well, Christianity is a poor man's religion. The poorer you are, the more likely you are to believe, and once we get educated and make money, we move on. Our study, and our study is not the only one, but our study does prove the more educated a Christian is, especially in the evangelical space, the more likely they are to stay in church. So only 3% of evangelicals with a master's degree have dechurched. 3%. So this goes after the myth of the boogeyman of higher secular education taking our children away. 4, going to college students and education. College students, Christian college students who are involved in a church and a campus ministry, they are 3 times likely to continue in the church. 5th, the overwhelming majority of people who dechurch will do so between the ages of 13 and 30. So this is a big deal. That is the time frame where it is most difficult to maintain your faith. In the BIPOC evangelical group, it was even harder during the ages of 13 to 30. It's hard for everybody, but you have 3 specific stages there. You have your teenage years, which are hard. You have your transition out of your parents' home into a college or a vocation. That's a hard season to maintain your faith. And then right after that, if you go to college, establishing your professional life, getting married, that season is the hardest season. And so there are implications we'll talk about in a little bit about that. And then 6, coming back to the education discrepancy, dechurching is largely a middle, low class, and low class phenomenon. Now this is very important for the church to hear. The top reasons for people dechurching, I moved and life transitions. So who gets hit hardest when there's a divorce? When kids come, expected or unexpected? Who gets hit hardest when you lose a job? Well, the lower class gets hit the hardest. Then that requires working long or unusual hours. It requires more transition in some cases when there are custody issues. So dechurching is the life issues that contribute to dechurching are hitting the lower class more significantly. And so we argue that there are some things that the church needs to do to be thinking about the middle to low class and low class to be able to engage and minister to them more effectively. This is a really interesting and for some people an alarming insight. Evangelicals are dechurching today on the secular right at twice the speed of the secular left. So here's another myth. A myth you hear is it's the secular left that's dechurching. Well, currently, the secular right is dechurching at twice the pace. Now, some of that is because a lot of dechurching has already happened on the secular left, but in terms of numbers, the secular right is almost caught up. So that goes against a lot of what we understand about the dechurched person. And we're going to have some discussion time, and we can dive in with Justin in a number of these areas, but we want to highlight some of these higher findings. So we spend largely the latter half of the book, latter 40%, talking about what are some things that we as a church can do given this data. Now, as an Orthodox Christian, I want to introduce caveats that the Bible gives us, like we believe the Holy Spirit needs to do something. The Holy Spirit opens our eyes. We know the end of the story. So I want to put those caveats there. But as people, we're still called to exercise wisdom. And so there's some wisdom that can be gleaned from this data. The first thing is that we, as church leaders, and I'm talking about us, we need to exercise more relational wisdom. And it's not just for church leaders. I think in some places it starts there. But exercise relational wisdom, humility, skills of curiously listening. Justin and I have talked about, if you know the term apologetics, defending the Christian faith, the apologetic of the 21st century, one of the main apologetics are going to be skills that look a lot like a counselor. So exercising that kind of relational wisdom. Invest in student ministry. This is if 13 to 30 is the hardest time to maintain your faith, then we as a church need to make big investments there. We need to be spaces where a child can feel comfortable having doubt and asking people about that doubt. We need to be a place where we are grounding what we believe and teaching it in a way where it's sending them out into the world in a way where they know how to live in that world. So that's going to mean, it can mean a lot of things in different contexts, but we want to invest in that generation. We want to give them space to ask questions. We want to give them real answers for the questions that they're asking in high school and in the transition out of their parents' house. Third, prioritize mental health. As Mike said, there's a lot of data that says that those who regularly attend church, they do find themselves in a better mental space than those who do not. But that doesn't mean that we've got the market on mental health.
That's right.
So we need to recognize that and continue to build. And Orlando is unique because we have the largest per capita number of mental health professionals of any city in the world. There are 11 institutions in Central Florida pumping out mental health degrees. So we have a lot of resources at our disposal. Now, we'd want to filter through some of those resources, but we have a lot of resources to take advantage of. Connecting to that, as a church, we want to lean into a holistic gospel. Mike referenced the phrase, a gospel that is true, good, and beautiful. In the evangelical space, which I come from, in the 20th century, we put an emphasis on what is true. And you saw this in our sermons, in our apologetic methods, in our evangelistic tracts. What's true, true, true. And that often came at the expense of, is it good? Is it beautiful? So now, fast forward to now, what kind of questions and opposition do we as Christians get? Is it ethical? Is it good? So that shouldn't surprise us. We would argue that the Bible and Jesus' gospel is true, it is good, and it is beautiful. You go over to the mainline space, and there was a different shift. There was a strong emphasis on what is good in society, sometimes among the dechurched mainline people, sometimes at the expense of what is true. So we as a church, whatever stream of the Christian faith we come from, we want to embrace a gospel that is true, that is good, and is beautiful, because that is what we are given. 5, this may be one of the more uncomfortable takeaways. Christians need to be willing to embrace an exilic posture. The norm for God's people over the history of the church, and when I say the church, I'm going back to Israel, Abraham, Jeremiah, in the early church in the New Testament, moving on in other areas of the world, the norm for God's people has been a state of exile. That's true today in the East, the global East, and the global South. So we need to know that what we've experienced over the past 150 years, while there are blessings in it, has not been the norm for God's people. And we need to be okay and know that God has been with his people and met them in exile, and we are no different. 6, identify a dechurched mainstream evangelical and invite them back to church. This is the lowest hanging fruit. And you don't have to be in an evangelical church to do this. We're just saying there's this group of 2.5 million people who are 100% willing to come back. We handed a lot of the money for our study came out of one church in Missouri, in Columbia, Missouri, and we gave them our executive report very early on, said, here's the data, do what you want with it. They saw this group of what eventually became called the dechurched mainstream evangelical group. They identified this group both digitally and personally, and in 4 months, they had hundreds of new people in their church. Hundreds. I want to go back to what Justin said. It's really important. This isn't just to fill up a church or fill up coffers or something. The children of the dechurched will likely, sociologically speaking, be unchurched. So this isn't just an investment in the current status of our local church. This is an investment in generations. And then lastly, we as a church coming back to dechurching being a lower class phenomenon. Maybe a better way to say that is it's hitting the lower class harder. It's hitting them harder. We as a church need to think about what we can do to minister and encourage people for whom life transitions hit harder than they do many of us. So with that said, believe it or not, that was a high-level walkthrough. we can get much more granular, but we wanted to have some time where we have Justin come up, and I know he to be able to have a discussion and go in different directions, double-click on certain things. So that's what we wanted to do. Now, Bishop, would you join us?
You guys have a copy?
I do have a copy.
So thank you for the opportunity to join in on this discussion. Just a few things before I get to some questions that I have. First, I read the book. I endorsed it. That was fascinating to be able to have the whole book in 45 minutes like that. Absolutely fascinating. But even more important to me was I could hear the tone of your hearts in that. I love the fact that brilliant pastors are informing us and with that put together. So thank you, because when you start talking about the spreadsheet, I'm imagining you, because I've referred to you as a calculator with a heart, and we're friends, but I'm imagining you sitting there looking at that spreadsheet and your heart being broken, and I'm really grateful for that. And you also dismantled some of the assumptions that people have about what dechurched are, and that's what was so helpful for me reading through the book. But let's get started on. So what was surprising, you just said it toward the end, is that education and dechurching seem to be inverse, and especially among evangelicals. So can you unpack that a little bit more about the dechurching education inversion?
Yeah, this was something that was really interesting to us. Our social scientist, the primary one, Dr. Ryan Burge, he's done some work in this area. He himself was surprised at how clearly it presented itself in this area, with 3% of evangelicals who have master's degrees have dechurched. So we know that to be a fact. Why is that? There's educated guessing going on, and there's more studies that should be done on this. There's some social theories that the type of person who wants to go to a university, wants to then get a master's degree, is the type of person, for a variety of reasons, who would want to find themselves in a community of thinkers on a mission. So there's a social piece to that. Mm-hmm. Others, and I'm not disregarding that, others like myself would also say Christianity is a thinking man's religion, that we are given a faith that makes sense. Even there are some things, miracles, that we can't explain. There's some paradoxes like the Trinity and Jesus being fully man and fully God. Can't explain that. We get to a point where we run into heresy. We have to engage the paradox. But largely, this story makes sense. There's historical evidence, there's scientific evidence, there's archaeological evidence. And so there is something about the legitimacy of the Christian story and the Christian faith handed down to us, the historicity of the Bible, that
You just pointed to your book and said Bible as well.
Yeah, I'm assuming there's a Bible somewhere over there, Justin. So there is a piece where education and Christianity are. They do go together. They coexist. You don't have to turn your brain off.
Yeah, that was another dismantling of an assumption that some people would have. Another one is you said secular right is dechurching at twice the rate of secular left. So I just want to highlight that. But to what do you attribute that historically and in the present time?
Okay, so I'm going to try and do this fast, but I think it's very interesting to see the progression of the era that we're calling the Great Dechurching. And again, we call it the Great Dechurching because it's not the Great Unchristianing or something. It's not the Great Deconversion, because a lot of these people are still Christians. The Great Dechurching really started in the 1990s. There are 4 reasons that this is true. First, the fall of the Soviet Union. This was a major piece to contributing to the Great Dechurching, because before the end of the Cold War, to be Christian and to be American were synonymous. So some of you are of an age, I can remember this as a child, when somebody during the Cold War, that era, would say, I'm no longer a Christian. It wasn't crazy for the next question to be, well, are you a communist? I mean, that jump wasn't crazy back then. Now, if to a younger person, that might sound like a crazy jump, but it wasn't. It was during the Cold War in the Eisenhower administration when "In God We Trust" was added to our money, when "Under God" was added to our pledge. That's not by chance. That Christian America was at odds, was in conflict with evil communists. So, fall of the Soviet Union, you could, for the first time, be an American and not a Christian. Then you have the rise of the internet. 1994, you have internet cafes coming up. You have internet by 97 in most of the schools and libraries. So not only was there freedom to not be a Christian in our society at large, you might still not feel the freedom in your family groups and social groups, but you could find like-minded people online. You could find other worldviews online. Then there was with the rise of the religious right, Pat Robertson's, there were some expressions on the secular and political right of Christianity that some people that were more left-leaning felt like, well, if that's what Christianity is, I don't want any part of it. Now, largely, some of these people are probably not Christians anyway and looking for reasons to not be, but then finish the decade, September 11th, 2001. And one day, America's enemies go from the evil communist atheists to religious fundamentalists. And so then there's a whole nother group of people that just at the very least, uses that as an excuse to not want anything to do with what they perceive to be fundamental religion. And so in that series of the 90s is when the secular left began to dechurch, Roman Catholic, mainline. But as we progressed through the early 2000s, the 20-teens into where we are now, you see the secular right catching up. Some of that is because there are fewer secular left people to dechurched. But there is a real phenomenon. There's a type of person, when I talk about embracing an exilic posture, there's a fear that is growing among the average Christian American about what's going on in our country. And so, anybody has their primary, secondary, and tertiary beliefs. The primary, the most important, and we go down in order. Well, as a Christian, we care about the country and what's going on, but primary things are going to be the doctrines that we're talking about. And there should be a trust that God's going to take care of his people, whatever our culture looks like. But increasingly on the secular right, there is a type of person who looks around and their primary belief has more to do with country or God and country. And that person is going to look around most churches and feel like, well, that's not everybody else's primary thing. And that's what they want to hear more of from the pulpit, from the congregation, in small groups. And so some of those people are looking and finding other groups with whom they can share that primary motivation. And they're going to get some church-like sentiments, like community and mission, but it's not going to be the church.
Thank you. Michael, you're doing the data, so I'm giving you this question, so I'm curious. And you wrote in the book, ethnicity casts a long shadow in the data. And so I'm asking you to unpack that, but also what are the implications of that reality? Ethnicity casts a long shadow in the data.
So when Jim and I were talking with one of our two social scientists, Ryan Burge, this is the phrase that he used. Ethnicity casts a long shadow in the data. So we asked him the same question, like, Ryan, what does this mean? And what Ryan meant by that is that even though our algorithm didn't have the ability to see ethnicity, it still sorted largely along ethnic lines. Cultural Christians, 98% white. The mainstream dechurched evangelicals, 91% white. The ex-evangelicals, 83% white. And then the BIPOC group, 0% white. Okay, well, how do you account for the algorithm sorting what looks like based on ethnicity when it didn't have the ability to even see ethnicity? So what Ryan, when we were talking with him, is ethnicity definitely shapes people and forms them in significant ways, in ways that we might not even be, that might be subconscious or even unconscious in terms of how we're formed and shaped. And there's, I don't think it shouldn't be a shocking revelation, in this day and age to say that there's not like necessarily one America. There are many different Americas. And, ethnicity is one of the things that's going to play into how the perspective that you have on any number of things: culture, society, the institutions that we see and experience. And so ethnicity is a very important category when it comes to dechurching, and certainly perhaps maybe even the most important category in terms of reasons why people left and reasons why they would be willing to return. So it's something that we should not ignore when we're thinking about engaging with dechurched persons.
Thank you. So what do you make of the 1 million affluent black men who left the church in the late 90s?
I'm not sure I can think of a group of people who are more interesting to me than this subset of the 1 million, extremely affluent black men who left in the late 1990s. I'm not really sure, by and large, what to make of this group. When we were, just kind of developing stories and narrative around this group of people, it was not the easiest group to just kind of to tell a story about. But you're talking about the kind of, a Colin Powell type, somebody who's, very high achieving and, very much advancing in culture and society, can navigate various differences in socioeconomic spaces with deafness, but yet is experiencing what looks to be significant friction relationally and maybe even institutionally in evangelical churches. Now, their story was a mixture of casual and casualty reasons. There's certainly relational friction, institutional friction, but there's also seems to be a fair amount of apathy that was there as well. So, when you do stuff like this, I got a whole other document of like 20 different areas. If I ever do additional research where I want more granularity, I want to know more about this group of people because I'm really curious.
So you started, and either one of you started out talking about the history of Metro Orlando area. And while your book you said it started about Metro Orlando, but then it turned into much larger, national, and what's happening. Going back to Metro Orlando, can you define Metro Orlando? How many counties is that? And what percentage of the dechurched? And you may have mentioned that, but I just wanted to...
I don't think I said the exact percentage. So the Metro Orlando area, it's the same area that the FCC, the radio, the radio demographics, 7 counties. It's Orlando, Melbourne, Daytona. And according to the Barna 2017 study, that area was 6%, fact check me here, Mike, but 6% evangelical and 42% dechurched, which means that about 2 million people in that area used to go to church and no longer do.
So that's the Diocese of Central Florida is 14. 7 of those, that's half of the diocese, and there's the Central Florida Presbytery, it's about the same size. So that's just highlighting about 2 million. That's a significant percentage of the dechurched for one metro area.
Yeah, so if you consider just, that there's 40 million people who have dechurched overall, and 2 million of them are in our metro area, that means 1 in 20 dechurched people in America are in our metro space. So this is our backyard.
That makes us the sixth largest dechurched city in the United States, which means the world, because this is an American phenomenon right now.
Jim, you mentioned that there was a previous shift that was after the Civil War, and we often hear that our country is founded as a Christian country. So what you're saying is that there were a lot of people before and during the Civil War who didn't go to church. Am I hearing you right? And if so, can you say a little bit more?
Yeah, there was the United States a Christian nation at its founding? That's a very loaded question.
That's why I asked it and didn't try to answer it at all.
Yeah. But it's a good question, and it's a necessary question to understand what's going on here. In 1776, according to Stark and Fink, 17% of the people in the United States went to church regularly. So 17%. That's not a very large percent. Now, that grew through the Second Great Awakening to about 34% up right before the Civil War. But I think there's something that we have to understand, and I feel like I need to lead off by saying I'm pro-United States and pro-Constitution. But the single, let me phrase it like this. The Constitution of the United States was the single watershed document into secularization in the West. And I make that argument by saying, if you compare it to the colonies, to the Constitution of the colonies, let's just say Connecticut, they talk about Jesus. They talk about evangelism. Now, there was an asserted effort in the U.S. Constitution to pull some of that out. Now, you know, there's some good in that, and they wanted a nation for all types of people, and I appreciate that. I'm not really taking any shots at the Constitution, just saying that the rise in Christianity, the way that we and our parents and grandparents have experienced it, was largely a 20th century phenomenon. And so that's why we began to see this boom after the Civil War of people who, there was some returning to church, but a lot of people who had never gone to church because only 34% of the nation went to church regularly before the Civil War. And you have to think a national tragedy like that would stir up some of the deeper questions in our lives.
The peak churching of America was in the 1970s.
The high water mark.
I love it. I love the peak churching of America.
High water mark.
Great phrase.
70%. So you have 4 times the percentage of American citizens in church in the 1970s than what you did at our nation's founding in 1776. Now, we've trailed off from that, and a couple years back, we dipped below 50%. And so now more people don't go to church than go to church. That's a significant shift, and we haven't been there for quite some time. However, it is a bit of a misnomer to think that, we have to get into kind of mythological territory to begin to really kind of take 1776 and that era in our country and kind of make it be the Andy Mayberry, kind of mentality.
So Jim and then Mike, you gave us some bad news about people, how they're suffering, some of the simple ways of moving. Despite the bad news, you both in the book, but also this evening, have communicated hope. And I would like to hear more, Jim, on the hope you have despite the bad news of your research.
Well, a lot to begin with. The truth is our friend. And so as a church, we want to know the truth about the areas that we live in. And so the more we work through this, I'm hopeful for how many people really seem to still be Christians. I'm hopeful in the willingness of 51% of the 40 million being willing to come back. I also see a real opportunity, and I would even say a window of opportunity, because the Great Dechurching is going to end one way or another. Whether everybody dechurched and there's nobody left to dechurch, or if it's reversed or stabilized in some way. But either way, this window is going to close, and we have an opportunity to invest and reach people who already have a Christian foundation. I've been a missionary in other parts of the world where there's zero biblical foundation, and there's a whole other level of work to do when people have no foundation at all. I'm saying we have an opportunity here and now to invest in people who already have that foundation. And it's not just an investment in them, it's an investment in generations to come in this country, because these people have children and grandchildren. And I would argue, so go the people today on this issue, so go the generations to come.
Michael?
My hope is twofold, and Jim mentioned this before. I believe in a God who's good and in control. And I believe in a God who also uses us and whose sovereignty works together with our agency. And so when I'm looking at all of the reasons why people left church, it seems reasonable.
Yeah.
I understand why. And when I can just zoom out, demystify why people left, I mean, the reasons make a lot of sense. You know, there's relational friction interpersonally, and then there's friction institutionally. Well, and then when I look at all the reasons why people said that they would be willing to return, they look like things that are in my control in terms of how I relate to you, and they look like things in terms of the institutional way. Well, we can do church better.
And they're reasonable things
They're
that
reasonable.
the church should be able to provide.
They're reasonable things. So it's like, well, when I look at, when we zoom out, we demystify what's going on. We look at the reasons why people would be willing to return. Well, we grow as people, and we grow as, church institutions. We learn from what we're hearing, and, by God's grace and through sanctification, we do better. So I have tremendous hope.
I have one more question that's practically oriented, but I want to see, because when you're up here and we're talking about all of this, if there's anything you left out, anything that you want to mention, because you've given us a lot, but anything that's swirling around of like, oh, I got to make sure I say this. So I know it's a curveball, but I just want to throw it open to you for a moment. Is there any theme, any topic, any question that you want to address before our final question?
We've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
Anything that we haven't addressed?
Okay.
I think we've covered a lot of, I just want to drill more into different things, but there's no major topic of our study that we've not touched on.
I wanted to leave it wide open for you to make sure you had all the bases covered. So last question, and whoever wants to go first, but I want to hear from both of you, is and you started to talk about this at the very end, what is one most impactful, lowest hanging fruit, practical thing people can do to respond to the data and what you're telling us?
So I'm going to cheat a little bit. I've already said, identify a dechurched mainstream evangelical, invite them. So I get to have another one.
You do.
I'm going to give a very Orlando answer. I think about a month ago, we're the third fastest growing city in the United States of America. Well, what's the number one reason for dechurching? Moving. Well, I want to mobilize our moving first responders, school administrators, realtors, people who can identify people when they move. And if these people are Christians and looking for a church, they can have a major impact in connecting them so they don't become one of the casually dechurched.
Right.
For me, it's the growth that we have as individuals. You might not be in a place where you can affect institutional change in, say, a local church. You might not have any position of leadership, these different kinds of things, but we can all grow as humans. And in the book, we kind of unpack this in a chapter entitled Relational Wisdom. And in that chapter, we talk about 6 key awarenesses that together, when you put them together, those things encompass relational wisdom. And I'll get them to you. You should buy the book, read the book. You can talk about this in much more detail. But those 6 key awarenesses are God awareness, self-awareness, others awareness, awareness of how other people experience you, cultural awareness, and emotional awareness.
Will you repeat those one more time? Because people are taking notes. I was sitting with them, watching people scribble notes.
Well, you won't have to take notes if you just buy the book. Because it's all there. But with God awareness, when we are sensitive to the triune work of God in our life, the Holy Spirit applying the work of Christ to us, to our whole being, we're sensitive to, Lord, who are you putting in front of me? And then when we have self-awareness, we have awareness of what is our story, what are our wants, fears, and desires, and hopes and dreams, all of those things together. And then when we have others' awareness, we're cognizant of the people that God just keeps putting consistently in front of us. Maybe they're nudge people, maybe they're dinner table people, or maybe they're people who need to be in our lives for years or decades, who knows. But then, and this is where I think people really struggle. And I know I struggle for it personally. I've had to go on a long journey for this myself. Marriage has been helpful, and ministry's been helpful, and friends have been helpful. Awareness of how other people are experiencing you. That's been a great struggle for me. And maybe, if you're another spreadsheet guy, you can you can say a little amen in your, in your soul. But how other people are experiencing us is really important. And those things can be bolstered if we are growing also in our emotional awareness and our cultural awareness as well. As we know, America's fracturing on significant levels. That's happening in the church. It's happening, on Main Street as well. So the more that we can embody those 6 key awarenesses, people will experience us with greater relational trust, and they'll experience us in a way that, oh man, Jim has something that's actually very attractive and magnetic to me. I'm kind of curious about those things. So a lot of these things just boil down to, the ways in which we've made mistakes relationally with people at the individual level. And if you get a lot of people together who have relational who have relational wisdom, well, you end up with a church body that's going to do better as an institution. So I think that's the low-hanging fruit for me.
And once again, you've dismantled another huge barrier, because we all think, this room's packed, because when they heard about dechurching, who's leaving, because they all have people in mind. We all have people in mind. So they're here, but the encouraging word to me, I could feel the hope when you all were describing it viscerally of inviting people. I don't have to go get another degree, or I need to find some leader who's going to do it. There's not some person I need to point to, but I can actually do something. There's people God put in my life who, and when you start doing, you even leaned in, you're like, they just need a nudge. How simple and encouraging that is, that the people who are reading this book, who are hearing this, that they are actually the ones that God is using for his kingdom, for his mission. And so thank you for your friendship. I have a few closing announcements for all of us, but I just want to thank you both for your friendship, for the hard work, for raising $100,000 to do this, to take the hours and weeks and months, because I was alongside you guys as you were writing these things, and for pouring yourself out and focusing on this, and for your churches allowing you to give your attention to this, and your families who let you have the time to write this, because I know there were sacrifices there. So thank you very much. So for some... They were both looking at their wives that whole time of they wanting them to actually come up here and get some of the applause too, because I know them. So they're right down here. And thank you for letting me be a part of this, and for Cathedral Church of St. Luke to host this conversation and this discussion. So what you all need to know is that Michael and Jim will be next door. If you go out the back doors to the building next door, it's called the Great Hall, but you can't miss it because it's the only other building next door. The bathrooms are over there. It's been an hour and a half, so you want to go over there. You can get a copy of the book. They will be over there for conversation, so don't come this way, go that way, and they will meet you over there. We also want to thank a few churches. While the Diocese of Central Florida and the Cathedral Church of St. Luke are hosting this event in our space, there's actually numerous churches that have been involved, and they're here. Their leaders have been here, and there's actually a network of people. So it's the Diocese, it's the Cathedral Church of St. Luke. Reformed Theological Seminary has been involved in helping get the word out. Mosaic Church, First Presbyterian Church of Orlando, about a quarter mile down the road. Grove Church, New City Orlando Church, Orlando Grace Church, where Jim's a pastor and Mike is no longer on staff, but is a member at the church now, and Orangewood Church. And that's encouraging because that's a lot of solidarity that was reflected from across various different traditions that are here in the 6% of the D Church. So that's churches joining together to learn how to love and serve wisely and well should be encouraging to all of us. Last, I would like to close in prayer, and then we will thank them one more time. So, the Lord be with you. Holy and gracious Father, we pray for your church. Fill it with all truth and with all peace. Where it is corrupt, purify it. Where it is in error, direct it. Where in anything it is amiss, reform it. Where it is right, strengthen it. Where it is in want, provide for it. Where it is divided, reunite it. Ever living God, whose will it is that all should come to you through your Son, Jesus Christ, inspire our witness to him, that all may know the power of his forgiveness and the hope of his resurrection, who lives and reigns with you in the Holy Spirit, one God, now and forever. And please join me one last time in thanking Jim Davis and Michael Graham. Thanks, guys.